In a small town where kindness still means something, Tom Miller's modest bakery was barely staying afloat. Each morning, he'd bake fresh bread and pastries, hoping to make just enough to keep the lights on. One cold winter evening, he noticed her, a tired woman in simple clothes, staring through his window at the day's remaining loaves. Without hesitation, Tom invited her in, served her a warm meal, and sent her home with fresh bread. He never expected to see her again, but the next morning, the thundering sound of helicopter blades shattered the quiet town's routine. There she stood, the same woman, now revealed as Sarah Chen, owner of the country's largest restaurant empire. Could a simple act of kindness really change both their lives forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath Tom Miller's feet as he made his way through the darkened bakery at 4 a.m. His grandfather's recipe book lay open on the worn countertop, its pages yellowed and spotted with decades of flour and butter. The familiar scent of yeast and aging wood wrapped around him like an old friend's embrace. Tom ran his weathered fingers over the handwritten recipes, each page a testament to 3 generations of bakers. His grandfather's cursive writing, elegant yet practical, detailed the secrets of their family's sourdough, the very recipe that had sustained this modest bakery through 2 world wars and countless economic downturns. "Time to wake up, old friend," he murmured to the sourdough starter, lifting the cloth cover. The living culture, maintained for over 50 years, bubbled quietly in its ceramic crock. Tom remembered watching his father tend to it every morning, teaching him the delicate balance of flour and water needed to keep the culture alive. As he began his morning ritual, muscle memory took over. The measuring of flour, the gentle folding of dough, the precise timing. These weren't just tasks, they were meditation. Each loaf, shaped by his hands, carried the weight of tradition and the lightness of hope. Through the front window, streetlights cast long shadows across Main Street. The town was still sleeping, but here in his sanctuary, Tom was already bringing tomorrow's bread to life. He glanced at the stack of bills hidden behind the register, their red final notice stamps bleeding through the envelopes. The weight of reality pressed against his chest, but he pushed it aside. There would be time for worry later. Mrs. Chen would be his first customer, as she had been every morning for the past 15 years. The elderly woman's dedication to his father's apple turnovers had never wavered. Even when the fancy new cafe opened across town, Tom started preparing her usual order, adding an extra turnover, their secret ritual since her husband passed away last spring. The first rays of dawn began to paint the sky in gentle pinks and golds. Tom Miller stood in his grandfather's bakery, covered in flour, surrounded by the morning's first batch of bread. He was more than just a baker. He was a keeper of memories, a guardian of tradition, and perhaps, though he didn't know it yet, someone on the cusp of an extraordinary change. Evening shadows stretched across Main Street as Tom began his closing routine. The day-old bread box sat nearly empty, a small victory, though not the kind his bank account needed. He'd given away more than he'd sold today, but the grateful smiles of local seniors and struggling students were worth more than money. At least, that's what he told himself as he updated his increasingly discouraging ledger. Through the storefront window, street lamps flickered to life one by one, their warm glow catching the gilt lettering that his grandfather had painted decades ago. Miller's Family Bakery, Esther 1946. The words were slightly faded now, like everything else in this part of town. The bell above the door chimed softly, probably Mr. Peterson forgetting his usual rye again. But when Tom looked up, he saw a stranger. A woman stood just inside the doorway, her business attire wrinkled from what looked like a long day. Despite her obvious exhaustion, there was something dignified in her bearing, something that spoke of quiet determination. She didn't approach the counter, instead lingering by the window display where the last few loaves sat in their baskets. Her gaze held a hunger that Tom recognized, Not just physical hunger, but the deeper kind that came from being far from home, from missing the simple comforts that anchored one's life. "We're actually about to close," Tom said gently. "But please, come in." The woman startled slightly, as if caught in a private moment. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "I was just admiring your bread. It reminds me of—" She trailed off, her eyes distant. Tom watched as she pulled out her phone, checked something, and then slipped it back into her pocket with a resigned sigh. The gesture told him everything he needed to know. He'd done it himself often enough, checking an account balance already known to be insufficient. Without hesitation, Tom moved to the day-old bread box. "Would you join me for some soup? I always make too much for myself." The lie came easily, kindness smoothing its edges. "It's my grandmother's recipe. Goes perfectly with the sourdough." She hesitated, pride warring with hunger. Tom busied himself with bowls and spoons, pretending not to notice her internal struggle. Finally, she spoke. "I couldn't possibly—" "Please," Tom said, ladling out 2 portions of the vegetable soup he'd made for his own dinner. "I hate eating alone, and it's been a long day for both of us, I suspect." Something in his tone must have reached her, because she slowly made her way to the small table by the window. Tom brought over the soup and fresh-cut slices of sourdough, still slightly warm from their afternoon baking. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind shared by strangers who recognized something of themselves in each other. She savored each spoonful as if it were her first meal in days. Maybe it was. Tom pretended not to notice how she wrapped her fingers around the warm bowl, how she closed her eyes with each bite of bread. When she finished, she reached for her purse, but Tom waved her off. "Consider it payment for the company," he said, clearing their bowls. He wrapped the remaining loaf in brown paper, the same way his father had taught him. "For tomorrow's breakfast." She accepted the bread with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, and in those 2 words, Tom heard volumes. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper, like recognition of a kindness long forgotten. She turned to leave. She paused at the door. "Your bread," she said softly. "It tastes like home." Then she was gone, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Tom watched her vanish around the corner, then returned to his closing duties. He didn't expect to see her again. Most strangers in their small town were just passing through. Still, something about her lingered in his mind as he swept the floors and counted the meager day's earnings. Later that night, as he prepared the next day's dough, Tom found himself hoping she'd find whatever she was looking for. In a world that often seemed to have forgotten the importance of simple kindness, sometimes all you could do was offer what you had, even if it was just soup and day-old bread. The next morning arrived like any other, with Tom's hands deep in dough before dawn. The rhythmic thump of kneading nearly masked an unusual sound growing in the distance, a steady whump, whump, whump that seemed to shake the air itself. He paused, flour-covered fingers hovering over the workspace as the sound grew louder. Mrs. Chen burst through the front door, bell jingling frantically. "Tom! Tom! There's a helicopter right here on Main Street." Before he could process her words, a shadow passed over the bakery windows. The glass rattled in its old frames as a sleek black helicopter descended, touching down in the vacant lot. Across the street, a small crowd of early risers gathered, phones raised to capture the unprecedented event. "Good Lord," Tom muttered, wiping his hands on his apron. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, squinting against the rotor wash that sent leaves and paper scraps dancing through the air. The helicopter's door slid open with practiced precision. A man in a sharp suit emerged first, scanning the area with professional attention. Then came 2 more individuals carrying tablets, followed by— Tom's breath caught in his throat. The woman from last night stepped out, but she was transformed. Gone were the wrinkled clothes and exhausted demeanor. She wore a tailored charcoal coat that spoke of quiet wealth, her hair styled with elegant simplicity. Yet her eyes, they were the same ones that had looked so gratefully at him over soup and bread just hours ago. She spotted him immediately and smiled, making her way across the street with graceful determination. Her entourage followed, maintaining a respectful distance. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Chen, CEO of Global Culinary Ventures." She paused, watching recognition dawn on his face. "Though you knew me under slightly different circumstances yesterday." Tom shook her hand automatically, his mind struggling to reconcile the hungry stranger with the poised businesswoman before him. "Miss Chen," he managed, acutely aware of his flour-dusted appearance. "Please, call me Sarah." Her eyes crinkled with genuine warmth. "I hope you'll forgive my dramatic entrance, but after last night, I couldn't wait to speak with you properly." Mrs. Chen, who had been watching from the doorway, gasped. "Chen, like the restaurant empire Chen's." Sarah turned, offering a respectful bow to the elderly woman. "No relation, I'm afraid, though I'd be honored if there were." She returned her attention to Tom. "Mr. Miller, your kindness last night, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten in all my years of building restaurants. The true heart of food isn't in profit margins or expansion strategies. It's in moments like last night, in genuine care and simple humanity." The growing crowd of onlookers murmured, phones still recording. Tom could already imagine the social media storm brewing, but Sarah seemed unconcerned with their audience. "Would you join me for breakfast?" she asked. "I believe we have some things to discuss." She glanced at his work table, visible through the window. "Though perhaps after you've finished with that batch of dough, I remember my grandfather teaching me that timing is everything with proper bread." Tom found himself smiling, despite his bewilderment. "You know about bread making?" "I knew how to shape a proper boule before I knew how to write my name," she replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "Though I suspect you could teach me a thing or two about sourdough." The morning sun caught the golden lettering of Miller's family bakery, making it shine like new. Tom looked at his grandfather's worn shop, then at the gleaming helicopter, and finally at Sarah, who somehow seemed to belong to both worlds. "I'd be honored to share breakfast," he said, "and maybe a few sourdough secrets." Sarah's smile widened. "Perfect. Though I should warn you, I have a proposition that might change everything." She gestured to one of her assistants, who produced a leather portfolio. "But first, I believe you have bread to finish, and I'd love to watch a master at work." As they walked back into the bakery together, Tom caught a glimpse of the local newspaper photographer capturing the moment. Tomorrow's headline would undoubtedly be spectacular, but for now, he had dough to shape and an unexpected guest to impress. Some things, even with a helicopter parked outside, remained beautifully simple. After the morning's bread was safely in the oven, Tom and Sarah sat in the bakery's small office. The space was barely large enough for the ancient desk and 2 chairs, but Sarah seemed comfortable despite her expensive attire. Her eyes caught the sight of something behind Tom, a stack of envelopes partially hidden beneath a ledger. Tom moved to cover them, but Sarah gently raised her hand. "Bank notices?" she asked, her voice free of judgment. "I recognize the red stamps. I used to collect quite a few myself." He hesitated, pride warring with honesty. Finally, he pulled out the stack. Final notices, pending foreclosure warnings, utility bills marked past due. They scattered across the desk like fallen leaves, each one a story of struggle and determination. "The recession hit us hard," Tom said quietly. "Dad got sick right when we needed to renovate. The medical bills." He trailed off, running a hand through his graying hair. "I managed to keep the doors open, but some months, it's by the skin of my teeth." Sarah nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of one envelope. "When I was 12, my father's restaurant burned down. No insurance. He couldn't afford it. We lived in the back of my aunt's laundromat for 2 years. She smiled softly at Tom's surprised expression. "The press likes to call me a hospitality prodigy. They never mention the nights I spent sleeping on flour sacks, helping Dad prep vegetables for his new takeout business." Tom studied her face, seeing beyond the polished exterior to something familiar. The same quiet determination he'd recognized in her eyes last night. How did you go from there to... He gestured vaguely toward the helicopter visible through the window. One restaurant at a time. One loan, one risk, one sleepless night after another. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a worn photograph. This was my first location. The picture showed a much younger Sarah standing proudly in front of a tiny storefront. The sign above read Chen's Kitchen in simple lettering. Her clothes were second-hand, but her smile held the same confidence she carried now. It was a dump, she said fondly, but it was mine. Every morning I'd make my father's recipes, praying each day wouldn't be the last. Sound familiar? Tom's throat tightened. He opened his drawer and pulled out another photograph, himself as a young man, standing with his father in front of the bakery. The window display showed elaborate wedding cakes, a specialty they'd later had to abandon when cheaper chain stores moved in. Dad was an artist with fondant, Tom said. Could make sugar flowers so real people tried to smell them. He cleared his throat. The skill's still there, but these days folks want grocery store sheet cakes. Can't compete with $20. A dozen. Sarah leaned forward, her expression intense. What if you could? What if you had the capital to modernize, but keep the soul of what makes this place special? She spread her hands. Your talents, your recipes, your tradition, backed by my resources and network. Tom's heart raced, hope warring with fear. I've had offers before. Developer wanted to turn this whole block into luxury condos, offered enough to clear my debts, set me up somewhere else. But you stayed. This isn't just a building, Tom said, his voice rough. Every scratch on that counter, every burn mark on those sheets. They're my family's story. Dad's last batch of bread came out of that oven the morning he went into the hospital. His last words to me were about maintaining the starter. He met Sarah's eyes. How do you put a price on that? Sarah stood, walking to the small window that overlooked the street. Morning customers were starting to arrive, drawn by the news of the helicopter and the smell of fresh bread. I'm not interested in buying your story, Tom. I want to help you. Continue it. She turned back to him. But first, I need you to trust me with something more precious than money, your grandfather's sourdough recipe. Tom felt the weight of generations on his shoulders as he considered her words. Through the office door, he could hear Mrs. Chen chatting with other regulars, their voices mixing with the familiar creak of floorboards and the distant hum of the refrigerator. This was more than a business decision. It was about legacy, trust, and perhaps something else he wasn't quite ready to name. Sarah's assistant brought in a sleek leather portfolio, placing it carefully on the desk between them. The morning sun streaming through the window caught the embossed logo of Global Culinary Ventures, making it gleam like a promise. Tom's eyes fixed on it, remembering other contracts he'd seen over the years, each one promising salvation, each one threatening to strip away his family's legacy. Before I open this, Sarah said, her hand resting on the portfolio, I want you to understand something. What I'm proposing isn't a buyout or a takeover. It's a partnership. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Last night, you didn't just feed a stranger. You showed me what's missing from most of my restaurants. Heart. She opened the portfolio, revealing a contract that looked surprisingly simple for a document that could change both their lives. I'm offering to invest $2 million in Miller's Family Bakery. The money would be used for renovations, equipment upgrades, and marketing, all under your direction. You'd retain majority ownership and complete creative control. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the contract. And what do you get out of this? 25% ownership, distribution rights for your sourdough through my restaurant chain, and, she smiled, breakfast privileges whenever I'm in town. The terms were laid out clearly: modernization of the kitchen while preserving the historic storefront, expansion of the bread production area, installation of professional-grade ovens that would quadruple their capacity. But what caught Tom's eye was a clause near the bottom: original recipes and traditional methods to be maintained as established by the Miller family. He read aloud: his voice rough with emotion. Sarah nodded. Your grandfather's sourdough starter stays exactly as it is. No shortcuts, no commercial yeast, no compromises. That's what makes it special. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. I have 57 restaurants across the country, Tom. They're successful, profitable, and completely soulless. What you create here, what your family built, that's real magic. Tom stood, walking to the shop window. The morning crowd had grown. Curious onlookers still stealing glances at the helicopter while pretending to study the day's offerings. Mrs. Chen was holding court at her usual table, clearly enjoying her role as unofficial bakery historian for the gathered crowd. My father used to say that bread is alive, Tom said quietly, that each loaf carries a piece of the baker's spirit. When he got sick, he made me promise to keep that spirit alive. He turned back to Sarah. How can I be sure this won't kill it? Sarah joined him at the window, their shoulders nearly touching. Because I made the same promise to my father. Different food, same spirit. She pointed to a young mother entering the shop with 2 children. Look at their faces when they smell the bread. That's not just hunger. It's memory, comfort, home. You can't mass-produce that feeling. But you can protect it, nurture it, share it with more people. She pulled another document from the portfolio. Architectural plans that somehow captured the essence of the old bakery while gently bringing it into the modern age. The proposed changes were subtle but significant. A demonstration area where customers could watch the baking process, a small cafe space that preserved Mrs. Chen's favorite corner, new windows that would flood the work area with natural light. I'm not asking you to change who you are, Sarah said softly. I'm offering to help you become more of who you've always been. Tom studied the plans, seeing his father's dream reflected in the careful details. The weight of responsibility pressed against his chest, not just to his family's legacy, but to the community that had supported them through 3 generations. There's one more thing, Sarah added, pulling out a final document. A personal guarantee. If at any point you feel we're compromising your values or your vision, you have the right to buy back my shares at the original investment price. She met his eyes. I'm not just investing in your bakery, Tom. I'm investing in you. The morning light caught her face, and for a moment, Tom saw both versions of her, the vulnerable stranger from last night and the confident businesswoman of today. Both equally real, equally genuine. He looked down at the contract, then at his flour-dusted hands that carried 3 generations of baking wisdom. Would you like to see how we make the sourdough? He asked quietly. Before we sign anything, I think you should understand exactly what you're investing in. Sarah's smile was warm enough to rival the oven's. I thought you'd never ask. The architect's blueprints covered Tom's old workbench, their crisp blue lines overlaying decades of flour dust and knife marks. Sarah stood beside him, her suit jacket now replaced by a borrowed apron, as they reviewed the renovation plans with the construction foreman. The load-bearing walls stay exactly where they are, Sarah was saying, her finger tracing the original structure. We work around them, not through them. This building has stood for 70 years. We're not changing its bones, just giving it new life. The foreman nodded, making notes. And the original ovens? They stay, Tom and Sarah said simultaneously, then shared a quick smile. The new equipment will complement, not replace. Sarah continued. We're adding, not subtracting. She pointed to a section of the plans showing a glass partition. Customers should be able to see the old ovens working alongside the new ones. It's part of the story. As the foreman moved away to consult with his team, Tom studied the subtle changes proposed in the blueprints. The old Douglas fir floorboards would be carefully restored, not replaced. The tin ceiling, black with decades of patina, would be gently cleaned but left intact. Even his grandfather's hand-painted window lettering would be preserved behind protective glass. You're being very careful with it all, he observed quietly. Sarah's hand brushed against his as she reached for another section of the blueprints. I learned the hard way that newer isn't always better. My 3rd restaurant, I let the designers talk me into a complete modernization. Chrome, glass, minimalist everything. She shook her head. It was beautiful, but it had no soul. Customers came once for the novelty, never returned for the comfort. Through the window, they could see the construction equipment arriving. Not the usual hulking demolition machines, but smaller, more precise tools. A craftsman carefully measured the original woodwork, documenting every detail before any work began. "Mrs. Chen is worried about her corner," Tom mentioned, watching their elderly regular peer anxiously through the window. Sarah smiled. "Show her this." She pulled out a detailed rendering of what would become Chen's corner, a cozy nook with comfortable seating, improved lighting for her morning newspaper, and a small plaque commemorating her 15 years of loyal patronage. "You think of everything, don't you?" Tom said, impressed. "I think of what matters," she corrected, then hesitated. "Speaking of which, I'd like to learn the sourdough process, the real way, from start to finish. If we're going to preserve your family's legacy, I should understand it completely." Tom felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the ovens. "It's a 3-day process. You'd have to be here early." "I'll be here at 4, she said without hesitation. "No helicopter this time, just me." The construction crew began their preliminary work, carefully documenting every aspect of the old bakery before making any changes. Tom watched them photograph his grandfather's original workbench, the worn spots where 3 generations of millers had shaped countless loaves. "It's really happening, isn't it?" he murmured. Sarah stood close enough that he could smell her subtle perfume mixing with the bakery's permanent scent of yeast and flour. "Having second thoughts?" "No," he said, surprising himself with his certainty. "Just remembering. Dad used to say that every major change in this bakery happened in sevens." Sevens. The original opening in 1947, the first expansion in 1957, Mom and Dad's partnership in 1967. He smiled at the memory. He proposed right there, by the proofing cabinet. Said the yeast wasn't the only thing rising that day. Sarah laughed, a sound that seemed to brighten the whole space. "And now here we are, 2027, starting something new." She turned to face him, her expression becoming serious. "I promise you, Tom, when we're done, this place will still feel like home, just a home with better plumbing." As if to emphasize her point, a pipe somewhere in the walls gave its familiar groan. They both laughed, the tension of change dissolving into something warmer, more comfortable. 4 a.m. tomorrow?" Tom asked. Sarah nodded, already untying her borrowed apron. "I'll bring coffee. Real coffee, not that brown water you call breakfast." "Careful," he warned with a smile. "That's another family tradition you're insulting." She handed him the apron, their fingers brushing again. "Some traditions," she said softly, "are meant to be gently updated." Her eyes held his for a moment, longer than necessary before she turned to leave. "Until tomorrow, Mr. Miller." "Tom," he corrected. "If you're going to learn the family secrets, you might as well use my first name." Her smile could have proofed bread. "Until tomorrow, Tom." True to her word, Sarah arrived at 4 a.m. sharp, carrying 2 thermoses of coffee that filled the bakery with an aroma rich enough to rival the sourdough. She'd traded her business attire for simple black slacks and a white button-down shirt, her hair tied back practically. The gleaming new industrial mixer, delivered yesterday, stood in stark contrast to the worn wooden workbench where Tom waited. "No mixer today," he said, gesturing to the empty workspace. "First, you learn by hand. It's the only way to truly know the dough." Sarah rolled up her sleeves without protest. "My father used to say the same thing about dumpling wrappers. Machines can't feel the soul of the food." Tom smiled, spreading flour across the work surface. "Your father was a wise man." He reached for his grandfather's starter crock, removing the lid with practiced reverence. "This is where it all begins. 3 generations of wild yeast, cultivated right here in this kitchen." Sarah leaned in, inhaling the complex aroma. "It smells alive. It is alive. Here, feel this." Tom scooped a small amount of starter onto her palm. "Notice the texture, the tiny bubbles. That's decades of careful feeding, consistent temperature, daily attention. His hands covered hers, showing her how to test the starter's consistency. Too thin, it lacks strength. Too thick, it suffocates. Like any living thing, it needs balance. The intimate gesture felt natural, necessary for the lesson, but Tom noticed Sarah's slight intake of breath at the contact. Her hands were softer than he expected, but there were old burn marks on her fingers that spoke of her own history with food. "Now," he continued, reluctantly stepping back, "we build the dough. Watch first." His movements were swift but unhurried as he combined flour, water, and starter. The temperature of the water matters. Too hot kills the yeast. Too cold makes them lazy. Sarah watched intently, making notes in a small notebook she'd brought. When it was her turn, she approached the task with the same focused determination he'd seen in her business dealings. Her first attempt at mixing was too aggressive. "Gentle," Tom guided, stepping behind her. "You're not fighting the dough, you're dancing with it." His hands covered hers again, showing her the proper rhythm. "Feel how it changes as the gluten develops?" Sarah paused, concentrating. "It's like it's coming alive under my hands." "Exactly." Tom found himself speaking softly, aware of their proximity in the quiet morning kitchen. "Every batch is different. You have to listen to what the dough tells you." They worked in comfortable silence, broken only by the sound of dough against wood and Sarah's occasional questions. The morning light gradually filled the kitchen, casting long shadows across the floor. When the first batch was finally ready for proofing, Sarah stepped back, flour dusting her clothes and a smudge of it across her cheek. She searched for words. "I've owned restaurants for 15 years, but I've never felt this connected to the food." Tom reached out without thinking, brushing the flour from her cheek. The gesture surprised them both, and he quickly turned to check the oven temperature. "That's what Dad meant about bread, carrying the baker's spirit. You put yourself into every loaf." Sarah touched her cheek where his fingers had been. "Is that why you couldn't sell? Because each batch contains a piece of your family's soul?" Something like that. Tom adjusted the oven's ancient dial with practiced precision, though when you say it out loud, it sounds rather romantic. "I like romantic," Sarah said quietly, then quickly added, "I mean romantic in the traditional sense. The idea of carrying on a craft, a legacy." She trailed off, uncharacteristically flustered. The morning's first customers would arrive soon, but for now the bakery belonged to them alone. The new mixer stood forgotten in its corner as Sarah began another batch of dough, her movements already more confident. Tom watched her work, seeing his family's traditions taking root in new soil. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll show you how to shape the loaves, if you're willing to come early again." Sarah looked up, her eyes bright despite the early hour. "Try to keep me away. Though," she glanced at the thermoses, "maybe next time we can try your coffee. It seems only fair since you're sharing all your other secrets." The dough under her hands continued its ancient dance of transformation, witnessed by the ghosts of bakers past and the promise of something new rising with the morning sun. The social media post that changed everything was deceptively simple. A customer's shaky phone video of Sarah Chen, the famous restaurant mogul, covered in flour, carefully shaping a loaf of bread under Tom's guidance. The caption read, "Real. Love story. Billionaire CEO learns to bake from small-town baker who fed her when she was hungry. Some fairy tales are real. Miller's Bakery. Sarah Chen. Kindness wins." The post exploded overnight. By morning, the bakery's window display was surrounded by photographers, and Tom's ancient phone wouldn't stop ringing. Local news vans lined Main Street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical sunflowers. "I'm so sorry about this," Sarah said, watching the crowd from their sanctuary behind the counter. She'd arrived at 4 as usual for their daily baking lesson, slipping in through the back door. "I should have expected it. The media always looks for stories like this." Tom continued kneading, his movements steady despite the chaos outside. "Stories like what?" "You know," Sarah gestured vaguely, flour dusting the air. Rich woman, humble baker, acts of kindness. They'll turn it into some sort of modern fairy tale, isn't it? The words slipped out before Tom could stop them. He kept his eyes on the dough, but he could feel Sarah's gaze on him. A reporter tapped on the window, gesturing hopefully with her microphone. Sarah moved closer to Tom, seeking shelter in the familiar rhythm of their morning routine. "They're getting the story wrong," she said softly. "They think it's about money and status. They don't understand." "What do they don't understand?" Tom asked, his hands stilling in the dough. "That I'm not here because of some publicity stunt or business strategy." Sarah picked up her own batch of dough, their elbows brushing as they worked side by side. "I'm here because for the first time in years I feel—" She paused, searching for words. "Real," Tom suggested. "Yes." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Real." Mrs. Chen chose that moment to bustle in through the back door, brandishing her phone like a weapon. "Have you seen what they're saying online? My granddaughter showed me the Twitter. People are calling you the bakery billionaire and the bread baron." She chuckled, settling into her usual corner. "Though they got your net worth wrong, dear," she added to Sarah. "They're saying 3 billion. You told me it was 5. "Mrs. Chen," Sarah laughed, but her cheeks flushed. "Oh, don't worry about Tom," Mrs. Chen waved dismissively. "He doesn't care about money, though he should," she added with a pointed look at the new equipment still waiting to be installed. "My Harold always said Tom had more talent than business sense." The morning light filtered through the windows, creating halos around the camera flashes outside. Tom watched Sarah move through their shared space with growing confidence, her hands shaping the dough with increasing skill. The media circus seemed to fade away whenever she concentrated on the bread. "We should probably make a statement," Sarah said eventually, looking up from her work. "Get ahead of the story before it spins out of control." Tom tensed. Public speaking had never been his strong suit. Sarah must have noticed his discomfort because she quickly added, "Or I could handle it. You don't have to—" "No," Tom interrupted, surprising himself. "We're partners now. We do this together." Sarah's smile was worth all the camera flashes in the world. "Okay, but first—" She reached up, brushing flour from his grey hair with familiar tenderness. "We should probably clean up a bit." Mrs. Chen cleared her throat loudly. "I'll tell them you'll be out in 15 minutes. And Sarah, dear," her eyes twinkled, "maybe stand a little closer to Tom when they take pictures. For business purposes, of course." After Mrs. Chen left to address the media crowd, Tom and Sarah stood in the warmth of their morning's work, surrounded by the smell of baking bread and possibility. "Ready to face the circus?" Sarah asked, straightening Tom's collar with careful fingers. "As long as we stick to the truth," he replied, catching her hand before she could pull away. "That this isn't about money or status or fairy tales? Then what is it about?" Her eyes met his, curious and hopeful. Tom gestured to the loaves they'd shaped together, to the carefully preserved old equipment alongside the new, to the space they'd begun to share in more ways than one. "It's about finding something real in a world of artificial things, about two people who understand that some traditions are worth preserving and some changes are worth embracing." Sarah's fingers tightened around his. "That's a much better story than Billionaire Meets Baker," she said softly. "Then let's go tell it," Tom replied, leading her toward the door where their private world was about to become very public indeed. Late one evening, after the media frenzy had finally begun to settle, Sarah and Tom sat in the quiet bakery, sharing the day's last loaf. She'd pulled an old photograph from her wallet, worn and creased from years of careful handling. The image showed a much younger Sarah standing beside a small food cart, her father's arm around her shoulders. "This was our first business after the restaurant fire," she said, smoothing the photograph's weathered edges. "A noodle cart on 28th Street. We lived in the back of Aunt May's laundromat, but Dad insisted on pressing our clothes every morning. Poor is one thing, he'd say, shabby is another." Tom studied the image. Young Sarah's smile was the same, Determined, bright with dreams bigger than her circumstances, her father wore a spotless white apron despite the cart's humble appearance. Every morning at 3, we'd start the broth, Sarah continued, her voice soft with memory. Dad had saved his best soup pot from the fire. It was all we had left of the restaurant, really. He'd wrap it in newspapers during the winter so the pilot light wouldn't go out, she smiled. We couldn't afford to waste the gas relighting it. Tom reached across the table, his flour-dusted fingers gently touching the photograph's edge. Is this why you recognized our old gas oven's quirks so quickly? Same model we had in the cart's upgrade. Our first tiny kitchen. Dad and I spent 3 years saving for it. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing a small kitchen with equipment nearly identical to Tom's. When I saw your setup that first night, it was like stepping back in time. The evening light painted, long shadows across the bakery floor, and the newly installed equipment stood silent, waiting for tomorrow's work. But here, in this moment, surrounded by the day's lingering warmth and the smell of cooling bread, time seemed to fold in on itself. Dad never saw the empire, Sarah said quietly. He passed away 6 months before I opened my first real restaurant. The night before he went into the hospital, he made me promise something. She swallowed hard. He made me promise I'd never forget what it feels like to be hungry. Not just for food, but for a chance. Tom reached across the table, taking her hand. Her fingers curled into his naturally, as if they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. That first night, he said, when you looked through my window, you weren't just hungry for bread, were you? Sarah's eyes met his, bright with unshed tears. I was doing my annual remembering walk. Once a year I leave the cars and assistants behind. I walk the streets like I used to, looking for... She paused. Looking for something real, I suppose. Most places they see the shabby clothes and turn away. But you... I saw you, Tom finished simply. Yes. She squeezed his hand. You saw me. Not the CEO, not the brand, not the net worth. Just me. They sat in comfortable silence, their joined hands resting on the old wooden table that had served 3 generations of Millers. Through the window, the last rays of sunset caught the gilt lettering, making it glow like a benediction. I've never told anyone about the cart, Sarah admitted. The official company history starts with my first restaurant. It's cleaner that way, more impressive. A college graduate's success story instead of a hungry girl and her father fighting for their dreams, one bowl of noodles at a time. Tom's voice was gentle. Sarah, that's not the part of the story you should hide. That's the part you should shout from the rooftops. She looked at him curiously. Why? Because it's real, like this place. He gestured around them. The fancy food magazines want to talk about our artisanal techniques and historic preservation. But the real story is in the scratches on that table, the worn spots on the floor where my father stood for 40 years. It's in your father's soup pot, wrapped in newspapers. Sarah stood, still holding his hand, and moved to his side of the table. In the fading light, she looked like she had that first night. Vulnerable, genuine, searching for something more valuable than success. The reporters keep asking if this is a fairy tale, she said softly. The billionaire and the baker. Tom stood, facing her. And what do you tell them? I tell them they're missing the point. Her free hand came up to rest against his cheek. This isn't about rescued bakeries or business empires. This is about 2 people who understand the value of things that can't be bought. Like what? Tom asked, though he knew the answer in his heart. Like tradition, like integrity. She moved closer. Like the way you look at me when I get the sourdough just right. The photograph of young Sarah and her father lay on the table between them, a testament to journeys completed and journeys just beginning. Outside, the world waited with its cameras and questions. But in here, in the quiet of their shared understanding, they had found something far more precious than any fairy tale ending. The review appeared in the Sunday edition of the National Food and Wine Quarterly, its harsh words stark against the glossy page. Miller's Bakery, a cautionary tale of authenticity lost. What happens when corporate money meets small-town charm? Nothing good, as evidenced by this once-cherished local institution. The sourdough, once legendary, now tastes of compromise and mass production. Progress, it seems, comes at a price, and in this case, the cost is the soul of the bread itself. Tom found Sarah in the kitchen at 3 a.m., hours before their usual starting time. She stood at the workbench, surrounded by discarded loaves, her usually impeccable appearance disheveled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. "I saw the review," he said quietly. "They're wrong," Sarah said, her voice rough with emotion. She picked up another failed loaf, weighing it in her hands. "We haven't changed the recipe. Not 1 gram of flour, not 1 minute of proofing time. Everything is exactly the same, except it isn't." Tom moved closer, examining the loaves scattered across the workspace. Each one showed subtle signs of trouble: uneven crumb, too dark crust, irregular shape. "The bread knows when we're upset. Sarah, Dad used to say you can't make good bread with a troubled heart." She turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I did this to you. My presence here, the media attention, the pressure to succeed. It's changing everything they loved about this place." "Sarah, no, look at these numbers." She thrust a spreadsheet at him, her hands trembling slightly. "Our production has tripled. The new equipment lets us make more bread than ever. We're profitable for the first time in years. But this," she held up the review. "They're right. Something's missing." Tom took the paper from her hands, set it aside, and reached for the old ceramic crock that held his grandfather's starter. "Come here," he said gently. "Remember your first lesson?" Sarah moved beside him, their shoulders touching. The familiar smell of the starter filled the air between them as Tom removed the lid. "Close your eyes," he instructed. "What do you smell?" "Wild. Yeast. Wheat. A hint of something I could never quite name." "That's 3 generations of care," Tom said softly. "Every morning, every feeding, every loaf. It's all in there. The reviewer isn't wrong about one thing. Bread does have a soul. But it's not found in production numbers or profit margins." He scooped a small amount of starter onto her palm, just as he had during their first lesson. "Feel that? The texture hasn't changed. The life in it hasn't changed." His fingers curled around hers. "And neither have we." Sarah opened her eyes, looking at their joined hands. "I wanted to prove that tradition and progress could coexist, that we could preserve what makes this place special while helping it grow. Instead, I'm destroying what I meant to protect." "No," Tom said firmly. "You're not destroying anything. We're learning. Growing pains aren't the same as failure." He led her to the window where the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the sky. The street outside was empty, peaceful, unmarked by yesterday's harsh words or tomorrow's challenges. "You know what we're going to do?" he asked. "Hide from the food critics forever?" Tom smiled. "We're going to make bread, the same way we did yesterday, the same way we will tomorrow. Not because of reviews or profits, but because this is who we are." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Make everything seem so clear, so possible." "I learned it from you, actually." At her surprised look, he continued, "That first night when you were hungry and tired, you still carried yourself with dignity. When you came back in that helicopter, you could have thrown money at the problem. Instead, you rolled up your sleeves and learned to shape loaves by hand." He reached up, brushing a streak of flour from her cheek, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "The reviewer got it wrong. The soul of this place isn't just in the bread. It's in the people who believe in it. People like Mrs. Chen, who brings her grandchildren here to learn about tradition. People like you, who understand that real value isn't measured in dollars." Sarah leaned into his touch, some of the tension finally leaving her shoulders. "So we just keep baking?" "We keep baking," Tom confirmed. "But first, we're going to do something else." "What's that?" "We're going to throw away every loaf you made while worried about that review. Then we're going to start fresh, together, the way we always do." He smiled, After all, some things can't be rushed. Not bread, not healing, not love. Sarah finished softly. The morning light caught the flecks of gold in her eyes, and Tom realized that some traditions, like falling in love over warm bread and shared dreams, were timeless for a reason. The golden whisk trophy gleamed under the competition hall's bright lights, its polished surface reflecting the hopes of 12 master bakers from across the country. Tom stood at their assigned station, arranging his grandfather's tools beside the modern equipment provided by the competition. Sarah moved around him, setting out ingredients with the precision she usually reserved for business negotiations. "You don't have to be nervous," she said, noticing his hands hesitate over the proofing baskets. "This is what you were born to." I'm not nervous about the baking," Tom replied quietly. "I'm nervous about baking for them." He nodded toward the judges' table, where 3 of the industry's most renowned critics sat examining their score sheets, including, he noted with a twist in his stomach, the author of their recent scathing review. Sarah touched his arm gently. "Hey, look at me." When he did, she smiled. "Remember what you taught me about the bread knowing when we're troubled?" The familiar words in her voice brought an unexpected warmth to his chest. "Using my own lessons against me, learning from the master," she corrected, then reached into her bag. "Which reminds me," she pulled out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "I brought something for luck." Inside, the cloth lay his grandfather's old bench scraper, its wooden handle worn smooth by decades of use. The blade bore a small nick near the corner, a battle scar from a long-ago accident that his father always claimed made it cut the dough more precisely. "How did you—" "Mrs. Chen told me where you kept it," Sarah admitted. "In the box with your dad's old apron. I thought maybe today was the right time to bring it back into service." Tom ran his finger along the worn wood, feeling the memories stored in its grain. "Dad used this to make my first learning loaves. Said a baker's tools carry the wisdom of generations. Then we could use some of that wisdom today." Sarah's hand covered his on the handle. "Especially since we're doing something a little crazy." Their eyes met, sharing the weight of their decision. While their competitors would be showcasing the latest in artisanal techniques, powdered this, deconstructed that, they had chosen to present something both simpler and more daring. Tom's grandfather's original sourdough recipe with just one small twist inspired by Sarah's father's soup-making philosophy. The head judge struck a small gong, signaling the start of the competition. Around them, other bakers rushed to their modern mixing stations, but Tom and Sarah moved with deliberate calm. She measured the flour while he prepared the starter, their movements synchronized by weeks of early morning practice. "Time to add your father's secret," Tom said softly when they reached the crucial moment. Sarah nodded, producing a small jar of clear liquid, her father's soup base, reduced to its essence, ready to be incorporated into the dough in a fusion. Of their family traditions, they had tested the combination countless times, each attempt bringing them closer to perfection and to each other. As they worked, Tom became aware of the judges watching their station with particular interest. Their use of hand mixing instead of the provided industrial equipment had drawn attention, as had their synchronized teamwork. "They're wondering why a famous restaurateur is playing assistant baker," he murmured. Sarah laughed softly, her hands never pausing in their gentle folding of the dough. "Let them wonder. We know what matters." The hours passed in a focused blur. While other competitors produced increasingly elaborate creations, Tom and Sarah stayed true to their vision. Perfect. Simplicity, elevated by understanding. When they finally placed their loaves in the oven, the entire hall seemed to fill with an aroma that spoke of history and innovation dancing together. The judging began. One by one, their competitors presented their technical masterpieces. Finally, it was their turn. Sarah carried their bread to the judges' table, while Tom followed with the story of their collaboration. "What we've created today," Sarah explained, her voice clear and confident, is more than a fusion of recipes. It's a bridge between traditions, between generations. She gestured to Tom. His grandfather's sourdough, nurtured for decades, merged with my father's soup base, a secret he protected even when we lost everything else. The critic who had reviewed them so harshly cut into the loaf, releasing a cloud of steam that carried hints of both families' legacies. His expression changed as he tasted it, professional distance giving way to something like recognition. "This," he said slowly, "this is what I was looking for at your bakery. Not innovation for innovation's sake, but evolution with purpose, growth with roots." He turned to his fellow judges. "This is how tradition moves forward." When they announced the winners, the Golden Whisk trophy caught the light like a promise fulfilled. But Tom and Sarah barely noticed it, too caught up in the moment they shared, hands clasped, hearts full, understanding that they had created something even more precious than a winning loaf. "Your father would have loved this," Tom whispered. As they accepted the award, Sarah's eyes shone. "So would yours." She squeezed his hand. "Think they're up there sharing a slice? Along with some very strong opinions about our technique, I'm sure." The trophy would soon stand in their bakery window, but its real meaning wasn't in the gold or the victory. It was in the way they had learned to blend their strengths, to trust their instincts, and to believe that love, whether for bread, tradition, or each other, only grows stronger when shared. The unsent letter sat in Tom's desk drawer, written in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the bakery's silence encouraged honest reflection. The paper bore traces of flour, like everything else in his world, and the words had flowed as naturally as water. "Dear Sarah, there's something about 4 a.m. that makes truth easier to find. Maybe it's the quiet, or maybe it's the way the world holds its breath before dawn. Whatever it is, I find myself thinking of you in these hours, even when you're not here shaping loaves beside me. I've been trying to find the right words to tell you how you've changed everything, not just the bakery, though you have in ways my father would have loved, but something deeper. You've changed the way I see possibility. Remember last week, when you finally mastered the perfect crust? Your smile in that moment was brighter than any future I'd imagined for this place. And yesterday, when you convinced Mrs. Chen to share her mooncake recipe, swearing a solemn oath to keep it in the family, I realized I've started thinking of you as family too. I know there are complications, the business, the media attention, the different worlds we come from. But when we're here in the quiet morning, hands deep in dough, none of that seems to matter." Tom folded the letter carefully, adding it to the small collection he'd written over the past weeks. Each one captured moments he couldn't bring himself to speak aloud. The way morning light caught her hair when she bent over the proofing baskets. How her laugh had become as essential to his days as the smell of baking bread. "You're up early." Sarah's voice startled him from his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, dawn still a promise on the horizon. Today, she wore a simple blue dress instead of her usual baking clothes, and Tom's heart did the familiar skip. It always did at the sight of her. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, quickly closing the drawer. "You're dressed up. Board meeting in the city." She moved to the workbench, running her fingers along its worn edge. "I wanted to check the starter before I left. And," she hesitated, "I wanted to see you." The morning silence wrapped around them, heavy with unspoken words. Sarah picked up a handful of flour, letting it sift through her fingers. "Do you ever wonder," she said softly, "what would have happened if I hadn't been hungry that night?" "Sometimes," Tom answered, moving to stand beside her. "But then I remember something my mother used to say about bread, that it finds its way to the people who need it most." Sarah turned to face him, close enough that he could smell her subtle perfume mixing with the bakery's perpetual scent of yeast and flour. "And what about the people who make the bread? What happens when they find each other?" Tom's hand moved of its own accord, brushing a bit of flour from her cheek, their familiar gesture that had come to mean so much more. "I think," he said, carefully, "that depends on whether they're brave enough to acknowledge what they've found." Sarah caught his hand before he could withdraw it, holding it against her cheek. "I had a meeting yesterday," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about expanding the bakery into a national chain. Premium locations, standardized processes, the whole corporate package." Tom's heart stumbled. "Oh!" I turned it down. Her eyes held his, steady and sure. They didn't understand when I tried to explain that some things can't be replicated, that what makes this place special isn't just recipes or techniques. "What did you tell them?" "I told them about 4 a.m. Her smile was soft with shared memories. "About learning to feel the life in the dough. About a baker who saw me when I needed to be seen, who taught me that success isn't measured in dollars or expansion plans." Tom's free hand found her waist, drawing her closer. "Sarah, I'm falling in love with you," she said simply. "I think I have been since that first morning lesson, when you showed me how to listen to the bread. And I know there are complications. The business, the media, our different worlds. But when we're here in the quiet morning, none of that seems to matter." Tom's heart stopped at the echo of his own unspoken words. "You know," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "for someone who owns a restaurant empire, you have terrible. On timing, I have 36 loaves to shape before opening." Sarah's laugh was warm against his chest. "Is that a problem?" "Not at all," he murmured, finally closing the distance between them. "Some things, like good bread and falling in love, can't be rushed." The drawer full of unsent letters didn't matter anymore. Their truth had found its way out in its own time, like dough rising when it's ready, like hearts finding their natural rhythm in the quiet hours before dawn. The wedding cake lay in ruins across the bakery floor. Its carefully crafted tiers collapsed like a fallen dream. Hours of work, delicate sugar flowers, hand-piped lace designs, layers of Tom's signature sourdough cake adapted specially for the occasion, all destroyed in a moment when the vintage display stand had given way. Sarah stood frozen, her hands still outstretched, as if she could somehow catch the moment and reverse it. The bride would arrive in less than an hour to collect her cake, a bride who happened to be the governor's daughter, whose wedding would have put Miller's Bakery on the map in a whole new way. "It's my fault," she whispered, staring at the devastation. "I insisted on using the antique stand." "It'll be perfect," I said. "It'll tell a story." "Well, there's your story." She gestured at the wreckage, her voice cracking. Tom moved through the debris, careful not to step on the scattered sugar flowers. That had taken Sarah days to perfect. "We've had disasters before." "Not like this," Sarah's composure finally broke. "This was supposed to prove that we could do both, maintain your tradition while moving into high-end wedding cakes. This was supposed to show everyone that our partnership works, that love and business can mix without—" She stopped abruptly, color rising in her cheeks. "Without what?" Tom asked quietly. "Without ruining everything." Sarah sank onto a flour-dusted stool, looking more vulnerable than she had since that first night at his window. "The board thinks I'm losing my focus. They say I'm letting emotion cloud my judgment, that I'm too personally invested in one small bakery. Are they wrong?" She looked up at him, tears threatening. "Yes. No. I don't know anymore." She picked up a broken sugar flower, its delicate petals somehow still intact. "I love what we're building here, both the bakery and us. But what if they're right? What if I'm risking everything my father and I worked for because I've let my heart make business decisions?" Tom knelt beside her, taking the sugar flower from her trembling fingers. "You once told me that your father made you promise to never forget what it feels like to be hungry, not just for food, but for a chance," she finished softly. "For something real. What's more real than this?" He gestured around the bakery, not at the ruined cake, but at everything else. The worn wooden workbench where they'd shared their first lesson, the ancient oven that had witnessed their growing love, the window where their story had begun. "Your business instincts brought you back here that morning in the helicopter, but your heart knew this place was special before that. Your heart recognized something worth preserving, worth building on." Sarah's hand found his, their fingers, intertwining naturally. But this wedding cake is fixable. Tom stood, pulling her up with him. We have 1 hour, fresh ingredients, and 4 hands that know what they're doing. More importantly, we have something my father always said was the secret ingredient. In any crisis. What's that? Someone to face it with. He squeezed her hand. Now you're the business genius. What's our strategy? The spark returned to Sarah's eyes as her mind began working the problem. We can't recreate all the sugar work in time, but she hurried to the refrigerator, pulling out extra flours they'd made as practice pieces. We have these. And that new stabilizing technique you developed for the sourdough cake layers could work with a simpler design, Tom finished, already reaching for fresh ingredients. More rustic, more us. They moved around each other with practiced efficiency, salvaging what they could and creating what they couldn't. Sarah's phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from the board, but she ignored them, focused entirely on the task at hand. Tom watched her pipe delicate patterns with sure, steady hands, and felt his heart swell with something deeper than pride. When the bride arrived, precisely on schedule, she found not a towering spectacle of sugar and show, but something more, intimate and unexpectedly perfect. 3 tiers of Tom's legendary sourdough cake, decorated with a cascade of handcrafted flowers that seemed to grow naturally from each layer. The design was simpler than the original, but it carried a warmth, an authenticity that spoke of hands that understood both tradition and innovation. It's beautiful, the bride breathed, touching one of the sugar flowers gently. It's exactly what I wanted without knowing I wanted it. After she left, Sarah and Tom stood in the quiet bakery, surrounded by the evidence of their near disaster and ultimate triumph. Without warning, Sarah began to laugh, a real deep laugh that shook her whole body. What's so funny? Tom asked, unable to help smiling in response. Us, she managed between laughs. All this worry about mixing love and business, and what saved? Us. The same thing that's always saved us, doing what we do best, together. Tom pulled her close, not caring about the flour that covered them both. So what do we tell the board? Sarah's eyes sparkled with the confidence that had first built her empire. We tell them that some investments can't be measured in quarterly reports, and then we show them our orders for the next 6 months. Every bride in the state is going to want a Miller's Original after today. And us? Tom asked softly. What do we tell ourselves? Sarah reached up, brushing flour from his cheek in their familiar gesture. We tell ourselves the truth, that some things, like perfect bread and real love, are worth every risk. The new recipe book lay open on the workbench, its pages still crisp and clean, except for the latest entry. Unlike Tom's grandfather's old volume, this one contained not just recipes, but stories, the heritage of 2 families slowly becoming one. On the current page, a detailed formula took shape. Sarah Chen's celebration loaf, a marriage of traditions. Your father would say we're breaking all the rules, Tom said, watching Sarah carefully measure ingredients for their latest experiment. She'd combined his sourdough technique with the 5-spice blend her father had once used in his signature dumplings, creating something entirely new, yet grounded in both their histories. My father would say, rules are meant to be understood before they can be respectfully broken, Sarah corrected, her hands moving with confident precision. Besides, he also said the best recipes are like the best marriages. They bring out the finest in both partners. The morning light filtered through. Windows that were now spotlessly clean, but still bore his grandfather's hand-painted lettering. The renovated bakery had found its rhythm, mixing old and new with the same care they gave their dough. Modern ovens worked alongside the ancient one, which they reserved for special loaves. The original workbench remained in its place of honor, now accompanied by efficient steel prep stations. Here, Sarah said, offering him a pinch of her father's spice blend. What do you think about the balance? Tom inhaled the complex aroma, letting it mingle with the familiar scent of his starter. It's right, he said simply, like it was always meant to be this way. Sarah smiled. the same bright expression that had first appeared when she mastered. The perfect crust. That's what Mrs. Chen said, though she also insisted we add a touch more star anise for prosperity. They worked in comfortable silence, their movements synchronized by months of shared dawns. The dough came together under their hands, Tom's traditional folding technique incorporating Sarah's innovative additions. When it was ready for its first rise, they stepped back to admire their creation. "You know what this means, don't you?" Sarah asked, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. "That we've finally found the perfect recipe for the grand opening?" She pressed a flour-dusted kiss to his shoulder. "That and something else. We've proved them all wrong. The critics, the board, everyone who said we couldn't blend tradition with innovation, that we couldn't mix business with love." Tom turned to face her, drawing her closer. "Exactly." She reached past him to make a note in their new recipe book, "though I still say we should call it Love at First Bite instead of Celebration Loaf." Tom laughed. "Now you're just getting sentimental," says the man who still has a drawer full of unsent love letters. "You found those?" Sarah's eyes sparkled. "Weeks ago. I was looking for the spare thermometer, and there they were, the most beautiful words anyone's ever not said to me." Tom felt his cheeks warm. "I was waiting for the right moment. And now?" He glanced at their experimental dough, slowly rising under its cloth cover. "Now I think we've learned that the right moment is whenever you're brave enough to take it, like trying a new recipe or trusting someone with your heart." Sarah reached for the recipe book, turning to a fresh page. "Then let's write our next chapter together." The morning continued its gentle unfurling around them as they tested and tasted, adjusted and refined. Each attempt brought them closer to perfection, not just of the bread, but of their shared vision. By the time Mrs. Chen arrived for her morning coffee, they had created something remarkable. "Ah," the elderly woman said, sampling their latest effort. "Now this is what my Harold would call destiny bread, when two traditions meet and make something better than either could alone." Sarah squeezed Tom's hand under the counter. "Does it have enough star anise?" Mrs. Chen's eyes twinkled. "For prosperity, yes. For a wedding, perhaps a touch more." Tom nearly dropped the loaf he was holding. "We haven't said anything about my—" "Dear boy," Mrs. Chen interrupted, "you two have been baking your way toward the altar since that first morning lesson. Some things rise in their own time." She took another bite of bread, nodding approvingly. "Just like this loaf, it's ready." When it's ready, Sarah reached for their new recipe book, adding one final note to the page. "Under Miller Chen's celebration loaf," she wrote, "perfect for new beginnings, shared dreams, and love that rises like well-tended dough, slowly, surely, and with a touch of magic." The morning sun painted their shared workspace in shades of gold, and the bread continued its ancient dance of transformation, carrying with it the hopes and histories of two families, two traditions, and two hearts that had found their perfect proof. 2 airline tickets lay on the ancient workbench, partially dusted with flour, a hazard of any paper that entered the bakery. The destination printed in bold letters: San Francisco. Sarah's fingers traced the edges of the tickets while Tom finished, cleaning the morning's baking sheets. "My father's original restaurant location is still there," she said softly. "Different name now, different owners, but the building—" She smiled at a distant memory. "He carved our initials into the back. Dr. Frame, when I was 6, said it was our way of marking our dream." Tom dried his hands, moving to stand beside her. "You've never taken me to see it." "I've never taken anyone." Sarah turned to face him, her expression vulnerable in a way few people ever saw. "After he died, I couldn't bring myself to go back. Built my whole empire looking forward, never back." She picked up one of the tickets. "But next week would have been his birthday, and I thought, maybe it's time, if you'll come with me." The question held more weight than a simple travel invitation. They both knew it. Going to San Francisco meant more than visiting an old restaurant. It meant Sarah finally sharing the most tender parts of her past, the dreams that had shaped her future. There's something else, she continued, pulling an envelope from her bag. The realtor sent these yesterday. She spread out photographs of a small storefront next to her father's old restaurant. It's for sale. Perfect location for a second Miller's bakery. If that's something you'd want to consider. Tom's heart did a familiar skip. Sarah, I know it's a lot, she rushed on, expanding across the country, mixing our professional and personal lives even more than we already have. But standing here, in this bakery that holds your family's history, I've learned something important. She gestured around them at the space they'd carefully modernized while preserving its soul. Sometimes the best way to honor our past is to build a bigger future. Tom picked up the photos, studying them carefully. The storefront had good bones, character. Like their current location, it had stories to tell. Your father's restaurant on one side, my bakery on the other. Sarah's eyes brightened. A piece of both our histories, making something new. We could start with the celebration loaf we created. Add some of his dim sum recipes that I've been wanting to revive. She paused, watching his face. But only if you're sure. This place will always be our heart. Tom set down the photos and took her hands in his. They were Baker's hands now, marked with the same small burns and calluses as his own. Remember what you asked me that first morning? If I ever wondered what would have happened if you hadn't been hungry that night. She nodded. I don't wonder anymore, he continued, because everything that's happened since, every lesson, every challenge, every moment of doubt and triumph, it's all led us here, to these tickets, these possibilities. He squeezed her hands gently. To us. Sarah's smile could have proofed a dozen loaves. Is that a yes? To San Francisco? Yes. He pulled her closer. To opening a second location? Yes. His voice softened. To spending my life building something beautiful with you? Absolutely yes. She leaned into him, flour dust and all. I should warn you, there's one more thing in my bag, more surprises. Sarah reached into her bag with slightly trembling hands and pulled out a small box. I know it's not traditional, the woman proposing, but then nothing about us has been traditional, has it? She opened the box, revealing 2 simple gold bands. I had them engraved with the date you first fed a hungry stranger. Tom's vision blurred as he read the tiny inscription. Love rises like well-tended dough. Sarah Chen, he managed, his voice rough with emotion. Are you asking me to marry you in our bakery at 5 in the morning? Actually, it's 4:30, she corrected with a watery laugh. And yes, I am. Because this is who we are. Early risers, dough shapers, tradition keepers, dream builders. She took a deep breath. Partners in every way, if you want to be. Tom pulled her into a flour-dusted kiss that said everything his heart was too full to speak. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers. You know Mrs. Chen will be insufferable when she finds out she was right about us all along. She already knows, Sarah admitted. I asked for her blessing first. She said it was about time. Apparently we've been proofing this relationship long enough. They laughed together, the sound echoing off the old tin ceiling that had witnessed so many chapters of their story. The morning light was just beginning to paint the sky, promising another day of possibilities. So, Sarah said, slipping one of the rings onto his finger, ready to start our next great adventure? Tom looked at their joined hands, at the tickets to San Francisco, at the photos of a future waiting to be built. With you, always. But first, he glanced at the proofing cabinet. We have bread to bake. Sarah's answering smile held all the warmth of their shared dawns. Always bread first. Some traditions are sacred. The rings caught the early light like promises made real, while around them the bakery hummed with the quiet music of another day beginning. Yeast rising, dreams. Proofing, love growing sure and strong as well-tended dough. The new bakery sign arrived on a Tuesday morning, carefully wrapped in layers of protective padding. Tom and Sarah stood together on the sidewalk as the installation crew prepared to replace the old gilt lettering that had graced the window for nearly 8 decades. The new sign would read, Miller and Chen Family Bakery, Estia 1946, reimagined 2027. Are you sure about this? Sarah asked softly, squeezing Tom's hand. She knew how much the original signage meant to him. His grandfather's careful brush strokes had welcomed generations of customers. Tom watched as the craftsmen began their work with painstaking precision. They weren't removing the old lettering, but rather installing the new sign above it, preserving the history while adding to the story. I've never been more sure of anything, he replied. Besides, Dad always said the bakery's name should reflect all the hands that shape the bread. The morning sun caught the fresh gilt letters as they were unveiled, making them shine like a new day. Below, his grandfather's original work remained, protected now behind crystal-clear preservation glass, a foundation for everything they were building together. Inside, the bakery hummed with its usual pre-dawn activity, but with subtle changes that spoke of their evolving partnership. Sarah's father's old soup pot had found a home next to Tom's grandfather's starter crock, both vessels now essential to their signature breads. The recipe book they'd started together was filling with new creations, each one a careful balance of innovation and tradition. Mrs. Chen sat at her usual table, but today she wasn't alone. She was deep in conversation with Sarah's Aunt May, who had flown in from San Francisco to help with the wedding preparations. The two elderly women had formed an immediate bond, trading stories about their respective family businesses and offering increasingly elaborate suggestions for the ceremony. No, Mrs. Chen was saying, gesturing emphatically with a piece of their latest experimental bread. They should exchange rings made of braided dough. Very symbolic. Aunt May nodded thoughtfully. And then serve them with my brother's secret soup recipe for prosperity. Sarah buried her face in Tom's shoulder, trying to stifle her laughter. Should we tell them we've already decided on a simple ceremony right here in the bakery? And miss out on more suggestions? Never! Tom pressed a kiss to her flour-dusted hair. Though I have to admit, the braided bread rings aren't the worst idea I've heard. The bell above the door chimed as the first customers of the day began arriving. The newly expanded space accommodated them easily, with comfortable seating areas that encouraged lingering over coffee and fresh pastries. The glass partition they'd installed offered a clear view of the baking area, where tradition and innovation worked side by side. Ancient sourdough techniques enhanced by modern temperature control, Sarah's father's recipes adapted for artisanal bread. Sarah moved to help a young mother struggling with a stroller, and Tom watched her with a heart full of quiet joy. She handled customers with the same genuine care she gave to their bread, remembering names and stories, creating community, as naturally as she created flavors. Your father would be proud, Aunt May said, appearing at his elbow. Both of them would be. She nodded toward the wall where they'd hung photographs of both families, Tom's grandfather with his first batch of sourdough, Sarah's father in front of his original restaurant, all the generations that had led them to this moment. We're trying to do right by their memories, Tom said. Oh, psh, Aunt May waved dismissively. You're doing more than that. You're writing your own story. She gestured around the bakery. Look at what you've created together. It's not just about preserving the past. It's about building a future that would make them proud. The morning continued its familiar rhythm, but with new notes added to the symphony. Sarah's business acumen had helped streamline their operations, without sacrificing quality, while Tom's insistence on maintaining traditional methods kept them grounded in what mattered most. They had found their balance, like the perfect ratio of flour to water in a well-made dough. As the sun rose higher, Sarah returned to Tom's side, smelling of warm bread and possibility. The contractors in San Francisco sent updated photos of the renovation, she said, excitement dancing in her eyes. Wait until you see what they've discovered under the old wallpaper in your future kitchen. My future kitchen? Our future kitchen, she corrected with a smile. Just like this is our bakery, our home, our life. Tom pulled her close, not caring about the customers or the flour that seemed to constantly dust their clothes. Speaking of our life, Aunt May and Mrs. Chen appear to be planning our entire future. I believe I just heard something about lucky dumplings served on sourdough. Sarah laughed, the sound as warm and rich as freshly baked bread. Well, we did. Promise to honor both traditions. The new sign caught the morning light, casting gentle shadows across the workspace where they had first found each other. Outside, the world rushed by, but in here, time moved at the pace of rising dough. Slow, sure, and full of promise. 1 year to the day after Sarah first looked through Tom's bakery window, they stood together in their kitchen at 4 a.m., preparing a very special loaf of bread. The recipe was simple, the same sourdough that had first brought them together. But its purpose made it extraordinary. "Ready?" Tom asked, his hands covering Sarah's as they shaped the dough together. She wore her mother's pearl earrings with her usual flour-dusted apron, while his father's old wedding ring now shared his finger with the one Sarah had given him. "Almost," she replied, reaching for a small jar of their special spice blend. The marriage of his sourdough technique and her father's wisdom that had won them the golden whisk. There! Now it's perfect. Through the window, they could see the preparations taking place in the pre-dawn quiet. Their small wedding would be held right here in the bakery, where their story began, with chairs arranged between the old wooden workbench and the modern proving cabinets. Mrs. Chen and Aunt May had spent days decorating the space with fairy lights and fresh flowers, transforming the professional workspace into something magical while keeping its essential character. "Did you ever imagine," Sarah asked, carefully scoring the top of their wedding loaf, "that night when you offered soup to a stranger, that we'd end up here?" Tom smiled, remembering that moment with perfect clarity. "No, but I knew something was different. Something about the way you looked at the bread, like you were seeing more than just food." "I was seeing home," she said softly. "I just didn't know it yet." They worked in comfortable silence as the wedding loaf went into the oven. The old one, the one that had witnessed 3 generations of Miller baking traditions and would now witness the beginning of a new chapter. The timing was precise. The bread would be ready just as their ceremony began, filling the space with the aroma of love and possibility. Outside, the sun began to paint the sky in the same colors it had worn the morning Sarah returned in her helicopter. But today, there was no media circus, no curious onlookers. Today was just for family, the one they'd been born into and the one they'd built together. The first guest to arrive was, of course, Mrs. Chen. She carried a special batch of mooncakes made from her secret recipe, which she had finally, officially, passed on to Sarah. "For sweetness in your marriage," she declared, setting them beside the other carefully chosen refreshments that represented both their heritages. Sarah's corporate board had been surprised by their choice of venue and simplicity, of celebration. "You could have any 5-star hotel," they'd protested, but Sarah had been firm. "We're having it in our bakery, where every brick and beam knows our story." As if to prove her point, the old tin ceiling gleamed above them, its patterns catching. The twinkle of fairy lights, the ancient floorboards creaked their familiar welcome as more guests arrived. The glass partition that separated the kitchen from the dining area had been decorated with photographs. Tom's parents on their wedding day, Sarah's father in front of his first restaurant, and in the center, the moment Tom had first taught Sarah to shape a loaf. "Something smells wonderful," Aunt May announced, arriving with an armful of traditional red paper decorations. She paused, sniffing the air appreciatively. "Is that the same recipe from the first night?" Sarah confirmed. "We thought it was fitting." "Ah," closing the circle. Aunt May nodded approvingly. "Your father always said the best recipes tell a story." The timer chimed softly, and Tom and Sarah moved together to check their wedding loaf. As they opened the oven door, the gathered family and friends fell silent, watching this moment that somehow represented everything about their relationship. The perfect collaboration of skill, trust, and love. The loaf emerged golden and aromatic, a testament to everything they'd built together. They placed it carefully on the old wooden workbench that would serve as their altar, its surface bearing the marks of generations of Miller bakers, and now the beginning of the Miller Chen chapter. Perfect timing, Tom murmured, drawing Sarah close, just like us. She smiled up at him, flower on her cheek, just like so many mornings they'd shared. Was there ever any doubt? As their small group of loved ones took their seats, Sarah and Tom remained in their kitchen for one more private moment. Through the window, they could see the street where their story had begun, where hunger had led to kindness, kindness to understanding, and understanding to love. "You know," Sarah said, straightening Tom's tie, "most people think our story is about a wealthy CEO and a small-town baker finding love. But it's really about two people who remembered what matters most. And what's that? That the finest things in life, like perfect bread and real love, can't be rushed or bought. They have to be tended, nurtured, given time to rise naturally." The morning light streamed through the window, catching the gilt lettering that now told the story of two families joined by fate, flour, and faith in the future. Their wedding loaf cooled on the workbench, its crust crackling softly like quiet. "Applause! Ready to start our next chapter?" Tom asked, offering his arm. Sarah's smile was brighter than any sunrise they'd shared. "With you? Always. But first, I know," he laughed, reaching up to brush the flour from her cheek one last time. "Some traditions are sacred.